Hello, I'm Caroline Jones. Tonight's Australian story is about a young Australian Army major earmarked for great things in the military. Matina Jewell accelerated through the ranks and served with distinction on challenging overseas operations. But it wasn't until she served as a United Nations peacekeeper during the 2006 Israel-Lebanon conflict that she experienced war at first hand, and with ultimately dire consequences. When it was all over, Matina Jewell discovered that the battles back home were every bit as difficult as surviving in a war zone.
I used to go dawn service with my dad, Little Austinville, back in Byron Bay. There was thousands of people. It was like the whole community turned up to the dawn service and then the parade. It was like, it was just phenomenal.
I feel very proud of having served my country as a soldier in the Australian Defence Force. Looking back at my 15-year Army career, I had amazing opportunities and fantastic experiences, but I guess it's with some mixed emotions, having been injured. I suppose when I joined the Army, it was always a consideration. We were always encouraged that if something did go wrong in that rare opportunity or rare case, you would be looked after at the end of the day.
I've been on 5 overseas missions, and I've been asked a few times today if these medals are my father's or my grandfather's, but no, they're actually mine, and these medals are my grandfather's from World War II.
This young woman has been through an enormous amount of achievement, of high performance and conquered challenges, and then to have had what happened to her change her life completely, and to see the bravery and the determination that she shows in getting back to as well as she can be, made it a privilege for me to get to know her.
Matina would strike many people as just an ordinary young Australian, but when she's been put under pressure and required to perform, she's done exactly that, and I think done a great job.
I was 17 when I joined the Army, and my decision to join was that I could do a university degree as well as my military training. After graduating from Duntroon in 1997, I spent 3 years as a lieutenant before being promoted to captain and posted on board HMAS Canimbla, one of Australia's 2 largest amphibious ships. I was 24 at the time. I was second in command of the ship's army department and also the ship's amphibious operations. And unfortunately, my boss, the major that was in charge of the army department, fell ill, and suddenly, even though I was only a 2-week captain, I was then an acting major and made commander of the army force on board Canimbla.
Which was a pretty extraordinary situation for a young woman to be in that role when most of her peers in commanding in those roles would have been in their early 30s.
11th of September 2001, the 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred in America, and immediately Canimbla was assigned to set sail to the Gulf to be part of the international coalition against terrorism. Often I was the only female commanding an all-male crew. I always felt that I needed to earn the respect of my soldiers, and if I had their respect and trust, then they would be happy to follow me. On the way to the Middle East, the commander of HMAS Canimbla was very aware of the attacks on the USS Cole the previous year in Yemen, which killed 17 American sailors, and he put in place force protection measures and appointed myself and the Navy operations officer to come up with a plan of how we would defend Canimbla and also train the crew. As part of leading this team, I needed to qualify in the skill of fast roping from helicopters. So once we got to the Middle East, before we'd bring Canimbla into a port, I would go ahead with my wharf security team and we would either speedboat insert or fast rope from a helicopter onto the wharf and secure the area from any mines or explosives or bombs.
She really didn't see any barriers to her physical limits, but she very much wanted to be part of the team. You know, she wasn't the type to be an exhibitionist or a self-promoter.
I had an amazing experience of actually planning and executing joint operations with the American Navy SEALs, who are special forces like our SAS, where we would be at night out there boarding and pouncing on smuggler ships that were bringing in illegal contraband, oil, arms, weapons. These operations, certainly the adrenaline's flowing when you're out there. With smuggler ships, it's unknown what their actions might be and you're certainly on high alert. Sometimes in the military you get thrown in the deep end and often that's the best way to learn, but it was a lot of responsibility at a relatively young age.
So this is the restaurant here, Sienna Marina. It's owned by Daniel, who's from Lebanon.
I was really looking forward to another opportunity of working in the Middle East, and I was selected to be a peacekeeper with the United Nations in Syria and Lebanon, and it was a 12-month posting.
Marhaba. كيفك؟
كيفك؟ منيحة؟
ممتاز.
Alhamdulillah. Nice to see you.
Around that time I met Clint Jewell, who is a marketing executive in Sydney. And I was instantly attracted to Clint. He has an amazing ability just to make everybody feel at ease.
Hey, here's cheers.
كيسك.
I would never have thought I'd have fallen for a army officer. Matty was a person that I was absolutely intrigued and captivated by. The more we spent time, the more we got to know each other, the stronger we felt toward each other. The fact was, it was just challenging to get time together.
It was because he mistook you for a military officer.
No, not
Well, it was probably a very tearful departure from Australia and quite torn because I really did think Clint was the man of my dreams and the right one for me. But I really also wanted to go and do this role that was going to be great for my future career. So I went to the Middle East as a peacekeeper, first to Syria and then Lebanon. I knew that there'd been a very long history of unrest between Israel and her Arab neighbours, Syria and Lebanon. But I didn't think that on this peacekeeping operation it would be far more dangerous than anything I'd experienced in my 15-year career. I had a great sense of pride wearing the UN Blue Beret. I really enjoyed the opportunity to support and help disadvantaged communities. I lived in Tyre, which is a port town in southern Lebanon, and this is where the UN had their rear duty headquarters. And I was assigned to patrol base Qiyam, which was 2 hours drive from Tyre, for up to 7 days at a time, and this was the most remote of the UN patrol bases in Lebanon. I was surprised how small the base was. It was only about the size of a tennis court, and there would be 5 UN observers operating there at a time.
So just a quick look at me. How you doing?
I had great teammates, but I was particularly close to 3 of them. Wolf from Canada, Du from China, and Big Mac from Finland. Wolf was a real larrikin, loved practical jokes, and Du was very quiet and industrious, very intelligent. Big Mac was another great character, loved his Formula One racing, and I got on just like a house on fire with Big Mac.
Oh, you got it on video.
All 3 of them treated me like a little sister in some respects, particularly Wolf, who I had a great sort of sibling rivalry with, and it just really was such a great team atmosphere. We had a very close bond. In fact, I do really consider them like brothers. As you can see, it's quite a spectacular view from our patrol base. We were located on the disputed border between Israel and Lebanon. And this is where the border starts between Israel and Lebanon. The United Nations had peace agreements in the region, and our role was to observe and report any violations by Israel or the Hezbollah. The building just over here is another Hezbollah position. So this is Patrol Base Kiam here, this designated by that little blue dot on the map. And the closest Hezbollah position is just here, only 75 metres from the patrol base, so you can see
That's
how close it is.
Hezbollah started out as a militia in 1978 after an Israeli invasion. Around Patrol Base Kiam were a number of important Hezbollah facilities. The first being a major headquarters located in the town near the base.
So up here was our observation platform.
I really am surprised that there's no overhead protection. When I visited Patrol Base Kiam in 1996, I was struck by the fact that for a base that had been there for 30 years, it still looked quite temporary. And also it wasn't as hardened and as protected as I thought a base should be, given that occasionally there used to be ferocious wars fought around it. And that exposed spiral staircase is on the Israeli side, so that's where all the bombs and rockets are coming from.
Glad I got the opportunity to come and visit you in Lebanon.
Absolutely. Having left Clint behind in Australia, I honestly thought the relationship wouldn't survive a year in the Middle East. That was a lot to ask for someone I'd only met just a couple of months before.
This is off Tia. Fantastic. Clearly I missed her, and after 3 months I decided to move to the Middle East also. Here we are on the boat, heading home after a great day. There's where we live. It was an amazing part of the world, a terrific place where one could have a great time.
Arab tunes blasting away.
12th of July on Patrol Base Kiam. We've had a call to go back to the patrol base as there's artillery fire, small arms firing around Patrol Base Hin. We have all the guys back here at Patrol Base Kiam. We've just seen a lot of activity and small arms actually firing in our area. I was out patrolling when we had an urgent call over the radio for all UN vehicles to move to the nearest patrol base, as the Hezbollah, in a daring raid, had ambushed an Israeli Humvee patrol. And in the ambush itself, 3 Israeli soldiers had been killed and 2 had been captured and taken back into southern Lebanon.
Whoa! Impact! Large impact! Aerial bomb.
No.
2 Alphas just been hit with an aerial bomb. This action sparked retribution from the Israeli Defence Force, the IDF, right along the border, and turned out to be the start of the 34-day Lebanon War. It is well known that Israel has a policy of retaliation with maximum force.
Flares.
I can still remember the stabilising fins off the back of this 1,000-pound bomb as it whizzed past me at eye level, the most 30 metres from us, and impacting into the Hezbollah position, Sierra Papa 1. Thankfully none of us are injured. There was a bit of shrapnel, and the blast from the rocket hitting the position actually came over the platform here where I'm standing now. There was certainly a sense of exhilaration and excitement on the patrol base in that initial stages of the war. For me, it was for 14 years of my career I've been waiting to experience something like this, and so it was, I guess, the pinnacle of your career to actually be involved in a war.
That's undisciplined.
I think in hindsight we should have been terrified of what was next, and there should have been more sense of trepidation from us as peacekeepers if Israel was prepared to take that action on day one, what might unfold over the days that came afterwards.
Clearly I was concerned about Maddie and her circumstances, being literally on the front line of a war. I was concerned also for my own safety. This is on the balcony, and there in the middle of the screen you can see a bomb that's just been dropped. Smoke from that. Here in Tia. I understood that Tia had become a target on account that Israel suspected that their captured soldiers may be in Tia. And so from day 2 onwards, my level of concern escalated, almost proportionate with the number of bombs that I could see landing in and around Tia from the balcony. 15th of July in Tia, seeing this in the screen, the smoke plume, smoke cloud, especially a bomb blast cloud, and they've re-hit targets as activity. Bombing and flybys pretty much became the norm. You've got to see it. And one day, Thousands of pieces of paper literally rained over the harbour, dropped by the Israeli Defence Force.
And this is the propaganda that they're dropping. PSYOPs, they call it. What's that mean?
Psychological operations.
Correct.
There were times when we thought that we might not see each other again.
We're just marking the roof as building has been a UN building, and marking it with flags. So
On day 5 of the war, there was an enormous explosion that really rocked the building I was in.
Wolf had joked about whether I put all my boyfriends through this type of testing regime of get them into a war zone and really see what they're made of and make a decision whether I still like them.
We've also had 4 direct hits on top of Sierra Papa 6.
In the first week of the war from Patrol Base Kiam, we reported hundreds of violations of the peace agreement, over 50 near misses and 2 direct hits to the base. The excitement and adrenaline rush had worn off a little bit, and I just had a sense that we weren't going to survive on Patrol Base Kiam.
The other thing to let you know is we just heard from Lima that UNIFIL is going to be shutting down all of the communications.
The peacekeepers were there to observe a truce. There was no truce to observe and report on. They're reporting on a war. That wasn't their job. The Israelis should have been told, hold your fire, the observer force is going out.
Because to me that's absolutely unacceptable to leave us without comms. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, so...
Any reasonable person looking at the circumstances that the UN observers were in could well have concluded that the UN were putting lives at risk.
Got the soldiers out here just doing the final preparations. The UN had 2 forces in Lebanon. The UNSO force, we were unarmed observers, whereas the UNIFIL force were armed peacekeepers. I was due to rotate from Patrol Base Kiam back into Tyr on day 2 of the war, and it kept being delayed each day until day 6, when 2 UNIFIL armoured vehicles, which are called CISUs, arrived at Patrol Base Kiam. The only reason why I had left the base first was that I'd simply been out there the longest. The CISUs had brought with them one of my teammates, Hans-Peter Lang from Austria, to replace me on Patrol Base Kiam. When I left Kiam, there was just Hans-Peter, Du, Big Mac and Wolf left on Patrol Base Kiam. It was an emotional sort of farewell at the position in that Wolf in particular was very concerned for my safety during this transit, in light of the fact that Israel had already commenced its ground invasion into southern Lebanon.
Okay, this is Maddie getting ready to depart for her trip to Tyr. As you can see, she's sitting in the front of the CISU. She'll be riding shotgun and giving directions to the driver.
The CISUs were manned by 14 soldiers from the UNIFIL force. As the highest ranking officer, I assumed command of the convoy and was also responsible for navigation.
Yeah, we're waiting to roll out these gates, man.
The UN wouldn't allow us to move without Israel giving a window of opportunity where they would agree not to bomb the roads that we were going to use. The journey from Patrol Base Kiam was quite treacherous, and a number of the roads that I'd planned to take had experienced blast damage from Israeli fighter jets and was simply impassable. And due to the mine threat in southern Lebanon, it's not an option to go off-road. So I was forced to take alternative routes and backtrack at certain stages.
As you can see, we've had an aerial bomb impact the road here. And we're going to have to turn around because the road's been taken out here with a bomb.
But we can try this.
Yep, let's give it a shot.
The transit from Patrol Base Kiam to Tyr would typically take 2 hours to complete, but on this occasion it would extend across 2 days.
But unfortunately we only got halfway and I've spent the night here at a UN position 9-1. We had a couple of lucky escapes during the transit yesterday, with the IDF dropping aerial bombs on us twice in very close proximity, as we're trying to actually first of all try and get into the CISUs from the patrol base and then later down the track. We also had a Hezbollah team fire a Katyusha rocket over our head.
I'm in the middle of packing up. Stuff everywhere.
We spoke that night, and it was there that I actually learnt that Maddie wasn't going to make it back into Tyr that day. That was pretty deflating. You know, I was quite concerned that she might not make it.
Both parties, Hezbollah and Israeli Defence Force, talking tough.
Their enemy is stronger and will outlast them.
It crossed my mind that I could be killed. bombs were coming really quite close to some of the apartments where UN families were located. Shrapnel literally coming through the windows and landing on the bed in the bedroom. So there was a decision taken to evacuate to the Rest House Resort, which happened to be where the UN headquarters was based. I opted to go there as well.
Okay, 18th of July. We've just been given the order to start moving into Tia, so we're just loading up the CZUs. As you can see, I'm in the CZU now. The troops aren't in yet.
I was exhausted and extremely anxious about the transit that lay ahead of us to move into Tia, but I really needed to just get control of those emotions and in some ways put on that facade again of when you take command of a group of soldiers, you need to appear confident.
Yeah, we're rolling. We're 3/4 of the way there.
Certainly during that 2-day transit on the roads, going through village and town after town that had been destroyed by Israel, it was quite disillusioning as a peacekeeper to see that level of destruction and the innocent lives that had been lost.
This area is popped an absolute pounding with shelling.
I think it was sad as a UN peacekeeper to see that the UN was powerless in this situation, and it leaves you to think, well, what good is the UN if they can't help people in need in a time of crisis?
The problem we've got at the moment is there's electrical wires down. We're not sure if there's electricity running through them.
One of the problems I faced as we were getting that approach into Tia was that every single road that I tried seemed to have been completely destroyed by Israel's bombing, and we'd have to backtrack all the way back and try and find another road.
We just hit another roadblock, so we're turning around again, trying to find another road.
There came a point where the window of opportunity given by Israel to move into Tia was coming to a close.
I think it was probably our last option to try and get into Tia.
By then I had exhausted all the roads on my UN-issued map, and I was desperate to find any road that would get us into Tia safely.
And you were using this map to navigate because there's not much detail there to navigate by.
No, that's right.
The map that Matina was given was a joke. That sort of map you wouldn't give someone navigating around Australia on a holiday, let alone a military operation that required absolutely precise understandings of where you were at any given time.
So I actually ended up using a road that's not marked on this map, just a dirt road that parallels the Litani River. Thankfully, at that point, though, there was a police position, a gendarmerie, and through the policeman's broken English and my poor Arabic, I was able to gain directions to cut through a banana plantation using a farmer's track and then try to get into Tia from a much more northern approach.
Because the Israelis are attacking from this direction, from south to north.
That's right. My theory was to try and get us further away from the fire that was coming from Israel. So whilst I was on this farmer's dirt track, I received a phone call from my UN headquarters informing me that Israel was about to commence its aerial bombardment of the Tia region, and we were actually on a road that was going to be targeted.
And we're heading to Tia as fast as we possibly can, so fingers crossed we make it.
Eventually we made it through to the outlying suburbs of Tia, and we were hurtling through the streets at top speed. Unfortunately, a civilian vehicle cut in front of our vehicle, and my driver had to hit the brakes hard.
I can't hear you, mate.
And because there's no seatbelts in these UN vehicles, I was thrown forward, impacting into the bulletproof windscreen of the CZU. I was in excruciating pain, and I was thankful that I had been wearing my Kevlar helmet and body armour. I knew I'd done an injury, but I had to keep this convoy rolling and get into the rest house in Tia. But what I didn't know at the time was the impact that this would have on the rest of my life. Later that day, I was seen by a UN doctor. She suspected that I had sustained a spinal injury. I was forced to spend 2 days lying flat on my back on a tiled floor whilst the UN coordinated a new medical evacuation plan.
Tia at that point was full of refugees looking to escape, but at that point there was still no way out.
My condition was deteriorating rapidly. I was actually sort of thrashing around. I was losing my vision and my speech.
For her to have been left abandoned with Clint at a hospital that didn't have arrangements with the UN for her treatment was just incompetent.
I simply received a text message stating that patrol base key armour's down, one of my teammates was dead. The patrol base had sustained a direct hit from an Israeli fighter jet.
We were still coping with our own situation where Maddie potentially had a broken back.
And that will give us continuing problems, and probably forever. Matina is really quite incapacitated on a day-to-day basis with her back.
And those injuries are permanent, and she's not expected to improve with time.
I'd lost my career, I'd lost my physical abilities, and I was also suffering from losing my teammates that were like brothers to me in Lebanon. When I eventually found out the details of what had actually occurred on patrol base Keyarm the day of the fatal bombing, it just made everything so much worse.
So it was a story that no one really wanted to tell. It was an inconvenient truth.
Hello, I'm Caroline Jones. Tonight we continue the story of a highly regarded Australian Army officer serving as a United Nations peacekeeper in Lebanon. When war broke out, Major Matina Jewell, then a captain, was seriously injured. It was just the beginning of a series of catastrophic events. Matina Jewell soon discovered that the battles back home would be every bit as tough as surviving a war zone. First, a quick recap.
I was only a 2-week captain and made commander of the army force on board Canimbla.
Which was a pretty extraordinary situation for a young woman to be in that role. She really didn't see any barriers to her physical limits.
I would never have thought I'd have fallen for an army officer. Maddie was a person that I was absolutely intrigued and captivated by.
So I went to the Middle East as a peacekeeper, but I didn't think that it would be far more dangerous than anything I'd experienced in my 15-year career. I had great teammates. We had a very close bond. In fact, I do really consider them like brothers. Oh, whoa! Impact, large impact, aerial bomb. This turned out to be the start of the 34-day Lebanon War.
There were times when we thought that we might not see each other again.
Thankfully, none of us are injured. There was a bit of shrapnel.
The Israelis should have been told, hold your fire, the observer force is going out. Any reasonable person could well have concluded that the UN were putting lives at risk.
We had a couple of lucky escapes during the transit yesterday, with the IDF dropping aerial bombs on us twice.
And we're heading to Syria as fast as we possibly can.
And we were actually on a road that was going to be targeted. And my driver had to hit the brakes hard.
I can't hear you, mate.
I was in excruciating pain, but what I didn't know at the time was the impact that this would have on the rest of my life.
We're in Tyre now. We're just coming through towards the rest house now.
If we get bombed now, we're only seconds away from safety.
Tell the guys to get ready to receive us.
On the 18th of July 2006, some 6 days into the Lebanon War, Israel was about to launch its largest barrage into the southern port city of Tyre.
I'm just so looking forward to hopefully seeing you.
I was at the rest house resort where the UN had its headquarters, taking refuge with UN families and other refugees. At the time, I didn't know that Maddie had had an accident. I was just anxious for her to get safely into Tyre.
I thought I'd just badly bruised my back, and I was hoping that, like any other sports injury I'd had before, that I'd be able to recover from this quite quickly. It was certainly a sense of relief when I first saw the rest house. I was relieved to see Clint, but my priority at the time was to immediately debrief the UN headquarters on all the road conditions that I'd experienced on that 2-day transit from Kiam to Tia. I was particularly anxious about my teammates who were left at Patrol Base Kiam and getting them to safety. Wolf, Du, Big Mac and Hans Peter, who'd just replaced me.
Maddie had mentioned that she'd hurt her back, but it was only when the night went on that we became aware of how serious it was. She was starting to get pain, and acute pain in her back, numbness and tingling down her back and through her arms and legs, quite incapacitated, not able to walk by herself. She needed assistance.
By the next morning, I was in excruciating pain. Later that day, I was seen by a UN doctor, and all she was able to do was give me some pethidine for the pain, and she suspected that I had sustained a spinal injury. Because the 2 closest Lebanese hospitals had been targeted by Israeli bombing, the UN couldn't take me there, and also the United Nations helicopter pilots refused to fly due to the danger of the ongoing war. So I was forced to spend 2 days lying flat on my back on a tiled floor whilst the UN coordinated a new medical evacuation plan.
What there should have been was a doctor and a medical team waiting for her, and a well-rehearsed medical evacuation system in place. Matina's situation is a testament to the inadequacy of the UN at the time. The UN was struggling with the crisis. They weren't able to cope. Eventually, an evacuation to Cyprus was organised on a cruise ship brought in by the Australian Embassy.
So we had to get Maddie from stretcher onto a small transfer boat, then onto the cruise ship for a 20-hour jaunt from Lebanon across to Cyprus. Getting on the cruise ship was such a relief. You know, Maddie received pain relief and morphine for the first time, and it was one of the feeling. It was just we sort of felt, we made it.
So this is the 20th of July. We're managed to get on the boat leaving Tia.
The doctor on the ship treated Maddie for suspected spinal injuries and was a bit surprised, I think it's fair to say, that Maddie had arrived on the ship without a spinal brace. I was quite aware that any mistreatment of a spinal injury can actually make it worse. So, yeah, I was worried for Maddie. When we arrived at Larnaca port in Cyprus, the UN doctor accompanying us couldn't be found, so Maddie was moved into an awaiting ambulance and I accompanied her. The ambulance driver asked, "Where to?" We hadn't been briefed, and so we travelled to the local public hospital.
And it ended up that I spent about 3 hours in emergency without medical care, and by this stage my condition was deteriorating rapidly. I was actually sort of thrashing around. I was losing my vision and my speech as my muscles had all gone into spasm. Apparently at one point a nurse gave an injection into my thigh, which sedated me. Clint was able to get in contact with the UN, and we were told that we were at the wrong hospital, that we should have been at the private hospital, the Apollonian Hospital in Nicosia.
For her to have been left abandoned with Clint in a hospital that did not have arrangements with the UN for her treatment was just incompetent.
So how's it back?
Well, still an ongoing recovery process.
On the 24th of July, things really took a turn for the better.
A bit of a coincidence, small world.
Maddie's former commanding officer, Andy Condon, arrived in Cyprus to coordinate the evacuation of refugees from Lebanon back to Australia.
You were 5001, but it all worked out in the end.
Well, I could have almost given him a hug. I was that relieved, and we just had a sense that things were going to be okay.
She was clearly in pain and discomfort. She was also concerned for her colleagues that were still in Lebanon. From what I understand, it's the UN's role to conduct the medical evacuation, provide the medical support, and conduct the repatriation. But I could see that clearly wasn't working, so we stepped in.
I just couldn't believe that out of this quirk of fate that he had arrived in Cyprus out of any of the Australian officers that could have been sent on that mission.
Witnessed 3 times hits on Sierra Papa 6, 16 artillery rounds that have landed.
A direct hit from an Israeli bomb obliterated the clearly marked UN Hilltop Observer Post at Khayyam.
On the 25th of July, the next day, some 7 days after I'd sustained my injuries in Lebanon, I received the terrible news. That the patrol base had sustained a direct hit from an Israeli fighter jet. It was a 1,000-pound bomb that was fired from an Israeli fighter jet that was a direct hit on the bunker of Patrol Base Khayyam, instantly killing all the UN personnel on the position. So it was actually 4 people that had died. Wolf from Canada, Do from China, Big Mac from Finland, and the Austrian who'd replaced me on the position a few days earlier, Hans-Peter Lang. I guess the information that night, it just seemed so surreal to the point that I didn't even cry. I couldn't have any emotional connection with it because it just didn't register as actually a real event. I could still picture the faces of my teammates, and I couldn't imagine that they were now gone.
We felt a terrible sense of sadness, but I don't think the depths of that reality had actually hit us at that point in time, because we were still coping with our own situation where Maddie potentially had a broken back, and it was my intention to get her an appropriate level of medical treatment, and that, in all likelihood, meant getting her back to Australia.
We are at the very back of the plane in a Qantas 747, and here's Maddie.
It wasn't until the end of July that my evacuation to Australia was organised, and I was just thankful to be finally heading in the right direction home to get some medical attention. I finally arrived back in Australia in Sydney on the 1st of August, 14 days after being injured. The following day I had an MRI scan that revealed the full extent of my injuries. And there was 2 wedged vertebrae, which is where the vertebrae is crushed on one side. 3 other vertebrae were fractured, and there was also associated nerve damage.
And in your lower back?
Yeah, lower back, mainly on the right side, so on my right hip, and I'm getting this pain sort of goes all the way down my leg.
Well, I think it's very unfortunate for a young woman of 34 to have multiple fractures in her spine. That's not normal there. Well, surgery is not possible for these fractures, and those injuries are permanent, and she's not expected to improve with time. These fractures are crush fractures, and it's not like a bone where you can put it back together and it will mend. The actual structure of the bone has been crushed, and it's not possible for that to repair. So if I get you just to come out towards me a little bit, and I just want to see how far forward you can bend before it starts to get really uncomfortable.
It's about there that I start to get...
Yep. It's a very unusual injury in a young person, particularly to have multiple fractures. And obviously they're going to be painful, and she's going to have to manage that pain throughout her life. But she also gets stiffness and restriction of movement, and it limits the activities that she can engage in.
The underlying traumatic changes are there, and that will give us continuing problems, and probably forever.
I had to undergo extensive and rigorous physiotherapy, which was quite painful, to try and get some movement back into my back. Feel it just in that
lower back still just sort of really...
Even today, nearly 4 years after my injury, I still have 3 physio sessions a week and a chiropractor once a week just to maintain the mobility in my back.
Now come down the other way, keep the legs crossed the same way though. Matina is really quite incapacitated on a day-to-day basis with her back, and things that you and I think are very simple, of walking down to the shops to get the milk. There's many days where she can't and ends up in emergency with pain. So, you know, for a young, very fit woman, it's very debilitating.
During this time, Matina was promoted to Major and given a demanding position looking after transportation strategies. But unfortunately, her injuries and the mental condition that she found herself in meant that she couldn't fulfil her duties as a commander. She felt bad about that and eventually had to withdraw from command and realise that she was on a pathway to a medical discharge.
I'd lost my career, I'd lost my physical abilities, and I was also suffering from losing my teammates that were like brothers to me in Lebanon. As a result, there was so much to deal with, and really I felt like my entire life had been turned upside down. I just felt like I was fighting things on every front. With the pain that I was experiencing, I found it very difficult to sleep. This then also exacerbated the anxiety and depression that I had. And I was having these flashbacks and visualising some of the near misses that I'd experienced during the war, and also the incident where my teammates were killed. Impact, large impact. From being a fairly confident person, I was now quite jumpy, and in public this created some quite embarrassing situations.
One occasion we were in Melbourne in South Bank, and outside the casino there are those flames that erupt in quite a nice restaurant, and Matty was under the table, found under the table a couple of times that night. So yeah, Matty was certainly traumatised by events of Lebanon.
Part of my problem was that in the army I had been trained to suppress my emotions so that in a theatre of war that you can put those feelings aside and hopefully make the right decisions to keep yourself and others alive. But the result was that I didn't know then how to decompress once I got back to Australia, and I really had no emotional connection to my experiences in Lebanon or the deaths of my teammates on patrol base Kiam. Eventually, this lack of emotional connection to my experiences was diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder.
G'day, Maddie. How are you feeling today?
Not too bad, thanks, Bob. Yourself?
Good, good. In the early 90s, I'd worked as a part-time volunteer Lifeline telephone counsellor. So we've been talking and continue to talk regularly about those issues. It's very hard though, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it's that sort of sense of guilt.
And she's got survivor guilt. And in her particular case, it manifests as 3 of her team members had families, had children. And somehow or other, if she had have passed, that would have been less of an impact on other people.
It just doesn't seem fair that there's kids out there that don't have their father anymore.
So a lot of complicated, conflicting thoughts, all leading to a confusion and, unfortunately, an inability sometimes to move on.
When I eventually found out the details of what had actually occurred on patrol base Kiam the day of the fatal bombing, it just made everything so much worse. My teammates had survived numerous near misses to the position and 4 direct hits from artillery onto the patrol base itself over only a period of 6 hours. And during that 6 hours, 10 times the United Nations contacted Israel to inform that they're hitting the patrol base, endangering the lives of the unarmed peacekeepers.
The Israelis continued to bomb. In the evening, the peacekeepers at patrol base Kiam said they wanted out. 30 minutes later, the UN agreed that they should be evacuated, but it would not be an evacuation until the next morning. About half an hour after that, communications were lost with the patrol base and it had been taken out.
And you can imagine the anguish of the soldiers and the men and women, unarmed military observers, who were down there in the service of peace.
We totally and unequivocally reject any charge that this was a deliberate act against a UN position.
Israel has said that this was simply a tactical error and that it was an accident hitting that position. I couldn't comprehend how it could possibly have been an accident when Israel hit Patrol Base Kiam with a precision 1,000-pound aerial bomb. These are very accurate laser-guided weapon systems that had destroyed the position, killing the 4 peacekeepers.
It's reasonable to conclude that the use of that type of bomb, a precision-guided bomb, onto a well-known location like Patrol Base Kiam, as well as continued bombing subsequently when a rescue team from the UN came to find what had happened, suggests that the UN and Israel had either stopped communicating or someone was ignoring someone.
There were 2 boards of inquiries conducted into the fatal bombing of Patrol Base Kiam. Both these inquiries were given little cooperation from Israel. It's important in terms of closure for myself and the families of my teammates that the truth about the bombing of the position is made public so that hopefully some of the answers that remain unanswered might be obtained.
How you feeling, Ty?
A bit sore off physio today.
I still struggle quite a lot with the survivor guilt, but I feel very fortunate that 1, that I'm alive, 2, that I'm not in a wheelchair. My recovery from my injuries was clearly going to take a long time, but it was compounded by the fact that during the vehicle accident in Lebanon, it seemed to have exacerbated a condition that first commenced whilst I was serving in the Solomon Islands.
Thanks, baby.
The job was pretty tough going physically. I became ill with an unknown or an undiagnosed illness.
Maddie would suffer the most horrific episodes of pain. The worst pain you've ever seen anyone in, where she would crumple to the floor in agony, doubled over and unable to breathe. The pain would be so strong it would actually induce vomiting, and as she was sick, so it would spiral and get worse and worse.
There you go. These attacks were happening as often as twice within the 1 week that I'd need to go to hospital, but on average, once a fortnight, I was being hospitalised.
I still can't believe it happened.
Unfortunately, at this stage, I was still involved in a long battle over my entitlements so that I could leave the army.
Unbelievable. The army wanted to retire Maddie on medical grounds. The problem we were having was that the abdominal complaint that was putting Maddie in hospital up to twice a week was undiagnosed. It couldn't necessarily be definitively said to be caused during her operational service. And so we were in a situation where Maddie was to be booted out of defence, but the Department of Veterans Affairs weren't going to cover this condition that was putting her in hospital. And so Maddie was going to be left without health cover, because clearly a private health fund's not going to cover a pre-existing medical condition.
Oh, Matina, Clint, thanks for coming in.
Hey, Greg, how you
Good to
going?
see you.
Hey, Greg,
How are
good to
you,
see you.
Clint? Come in.
I was quite disillusioned by this process, and as a result, I was forced to hire a civilian lawyer at my own expense.
That was a very important outcome because obviously you needed the gold card.
My mystery illness was finally diagnosed as a diaphragm rupture, and I did eventually get cover under the Department of Veterans Affairs for my health.
They talk about the fact that you were unarmed and not authorised to use force to achieve your objectives.
The 4th of May in 2009, I was medically discharged from the Army.
Matina's experience in having to endure a 3-year battle between being medically discharged and having her injuries accepted is not dissimilar to what a lot of other Defence Force members go through. There seems to be a need to amend the legislation that's available to ensure that these delays are reduced and there's some certainty for the member discharging with medical conditions to know what their entitlements are before they are medically discharged.
After my discharge from the Army, Clint and I decided to travel to visit the graves and the families of my teammates. It was something that I just felt that we needed to do, and I really wanted to pay my respects. I really felt a flood of emotions, and I guess for the first time it emotionally hit me that these guys were never coming home to their families. I don't think I was emotionally ready to go and see my Austrian teammate Hans-Peter's grave, since I was still feeling such a strong sense of survivor guilt, having had Hans-Peter replace me on Patrol Base Kiam. I plan to, at some stage, definitely go to see him and say my farewells, but I think that will be a few years down the track.
For Matina, it became evident that this was a story that nobody wanted told.
Is this the one you wanted?
It was an inconvenient truth, and that made her feel that both she and her colleagues who had made the ultimate sacrifice had been brushed aside.
And
she felt entitled to have her service in Lebanon, and certainly at the time that she was injured, recognised as war service with the appropriate medal and benefits, not simply as an observer role.
Republic of Lebanon Wounded in Combat decoration, so yeah.
So they called it war?
Yeah.
Complicating her distress at this time was that the Lebanese government had awarded her 2 medals, one for the bravery that she had displayed and the other for being wounded on a battlefield. But the Australian government refused to recognise these medals. In April this year, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet rejected a recommendation from the Department of Defence for Matina's service to be recognised as under warlike conditions, noting that the Department of Veterans Affairs had also opposed recognition. Earlier this month, the government was alerted to the planned broadcast of this television program about Matina's story, and new material was added to support Matina's case. These issues have now been resolved. Matina has her recognition and her medal.
I'm hoping that by telling my story that we can fix these processes so that soldiers in the future won't have to endure what I've been through.
Do you want to go to those medals now?
Yeah, if we can do them now, that'd be great. I think I would have been very difficult to live with over that 3-year period. I just felt that I was no longer the woman that Clint had fallen in love with. But I feared if he should leave me, and I wouldn't have blamed him if he did, that I would have definitely hit absolute rock bottom, and I don't know if I could have recovered from that point.
So your grandfather was a very brave man. For me, there was never any doubt. And in November 2008, we got married.
I'm now at a stage where I'm feeling positive about my future, focusing on the fact that it could have been a lot worse than the situation I'm in. So I've now started a new civilian life.
Good boy, Kiam.
Looking back, I feel very proud of my 15-year service in the Australian Army, and if I had my time again, I would do it all again.
Kiam's a great cat.
I gained a great many skills in the Defence Force,
On his chin.
a Bachelor of Science and also a Master's degree in Project Management. And I'm leaving my options open for potentially some corporate roles or even consultancy, running my own small business.
What sort of a cat likes being brushed?
I guess for anyone that has been through tragedy or a life-changing event, I hope that they can find something tangible to hold on to. For me, that was Clint. He helped me turn my life around and to ensure that the best years are ahead of us rather than behind.
Wolf wanted to call his dog Kiam.
These mist-covered mountains are a home now for me, but my home is the lowlands, and always will be. Someday you'll return to your valleys and your farms, and you'll know